Hey, welcome to another episode of Inspirational Focus with Deacon Terry Acox. Terry's going to be talking about the book of Revelation, so stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Inspirational Focus. You know, the topic that we have today, the book of Revelation, I think is one of the most interesting but most confusing of all the different books in the Bible. Because I've read it several times and I'm scratching my head going, what does it mean?
Well, a lot of people have been doing that for many centuries. The book of Revelation is really very difficult to understand because one of the problems is you can't read it literally.
Well, maybe
like you would a history book, for example.
Yeah.
There's a lot of symbolism and a lot of, I don't know, unfamiliar language in it. That if you were to give this to a Hollywood screenwriter, he could almost make a monster movie out of it, because you've got beasts and all kinds of different creatures in it, lambs that have 7 heads and faces on each side of that head. You can
that is amazing, and I even think that the controversy about who wrote the Revelation. Some people told me it was John. They assumed it was an apostle, and then there was a John the Evangelist, and So who did write the book of Revelation?
The short story is we really don't know.
Oh, okay.
A lot of people think, and this is traditionally in the Catholic Church, we believe that the evangelist John, who was the Apostle John, wrote both the Gospel of John and the 3 letters of John and the book of Revelation. But there are different views. This view is held by some of the more well-known fathers of the church, such as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and others. But another view of this is that we don't know that this was the same John. In the book of Revelation, John identifies himself as being the writer of the book, but in the Gospel of John and in the letters of John, the author is never identified. So that's one of the reasons why some people hold the view that the book of Revelation was written by somebody other than the Apostle John.
Oh, okay.
And that is a view also held by many notable fathers of the church, such as John Chrysostom, and others.
There's so many.
But the tradition is that the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John, the letters of John, and the book of Revelation.
So just out of curiosity, I think time becomes very important. We did not have printing presses back then. And so consequently, because many of the Christians were being killed or martyred, etc., about when do you think the book of Revelation was written?
Well, there's a couple of views on that also. Some believe that it was written about between the years of 65 and 70.
Oh, okay. All right. A.D.
A.D.
Yeah, okay.
Right. Between the years 65 and 70 A.D. And that was because that was during the reign of the Emperor Nero, who was a great persecutor of the church. He would go out, grab Christians off the street, and do whatever he did to them, feed them to the lions or sacrifice them in pagan worship or whatever.
It was my understanding at that time that the emperors really felt that they were gods.
Yeah,
and
the emperors,
Christians did not bow to Nero.
Right, but the Jews at the time didn't either.
Right,
but they were exempted by law, if you will.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
they did not have to do this. And for various periods during this time, the Christians were considered a sect of the Jewish religion. And depending on whoever was in power, they could persecute anybody or they could not persecute anybody.
Oh, that's interesting. So when the book of Revelation was written and it was stored, I'm assuming it was not because there was no printing press. It wasn't totally accepted throughout the Christian communities because, and so it took some time for the communities. First of all, you had to get through the persecutions.
Right.
So when did finally the Catholic Church sort of recognize the importance of the Book of Revelation?
Well, there were councils being held, and long about the 4th century or so, when the council started putting together the actual canon of the Bible.
I see.
They decided that these books from the Old Testament and these books for the New Testament were going to be the canon. They said, well, we can include the Gospel of John here. But then there were other people in the church who said that, this is not really, inspiring word or whatever.
Okay.
Not inspiring to the masses, to the people. Although it may have been inspired by God. We just don't know. The type of literature it is, the apocalyptic type literature, doesn't really lend itself in comparison with all the other books we've got.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's sort of a unique book of the Bible.
Right. And it was actually, Revelation was the last book that was accepted into the Roman canon.
Now, during the Council of Nicaea, that was about 325,
about 325.
That is where a number of, first of all, Christians were no longer persecuted.
Right.
And so they all banded together because you had many enclaves of Christians, and they banded together to sort of establish some of the precepts of the Catholic Church. And so when you're saying that this was the last book, you're indicating that they established all the different New Testament, Old Testament, the Gospels,
right.
And then this sort of concluded the Bible.
That was how the Bible was put together.
I see.
During these councils.
Okay, all right.
And then the various councils over the years said, yeah, this Revelation was part of the canon. Other councils actually said no, it was not. And so finally, I don't know how often this went back and forth, but it did go back and forth a little bit. And finally, about the 5th century or so, the church put a stop to it and said, this is the Roman canon, which includes the book of Revelation.
So do all the Bibles in the Catholic Church accept Book of Revelation?
All the Bibles in the Western Church, okay. As you recall, back in the 11th century, the Eastern Church broke off from the Western Church, and some of the churches in the Eastern Church do not accept the Book of Revelation.
So the Greek Orthodox does not.
I don't know which ones.
Right.
When I was doing research for this, it just said some of the churches do not accept it.
Okay. And I'm also of the understanding that some of the different denominations in the Protestant churches, some accepted, some don't. Is that possible?
That's true. I don't know which ones. Yeah. I didn't look into that.
Yeah. So even today, it remains to be a very controversial book.
It is a controversial book. And it's in a large part due to the way it's written. I said there's a lot of symbolism and in the book of Revelation.
Numbers, something I found fascinating. They talk about the 7 angels, they talk about the different numbers, and they constantly use the numbers 3, 7, and 12, or multiples of that. And I found that fascinating, that it sort of fit in with the earlier viewpoints of the Jewish faith and the Christian faiths and some of those other faiths.
Yeah, they use, numbers mean a lot of different things. For example, you mentioned the number 7. 7 indicates completion or completeness, that type of thing. 12 is reminiscent of the 12 tribes of Israel. You'll find the number 1,000 used a few times throughout the Bible. And 1,000 doesn't mean like it does to us. Right. It's not the number that comes after 999. 1,000 in biblical terms means a great number, a very large number.
Oh, okay.
There's a verse in St. Peter, one of the letters of Peter, that says a day something like a day in the life of God is like 1,000 years or something like that. They don't mean just 1,000 years.
Right.
They mean a very long time.
Well, the numbers that we use, the numbers are the letters of the math, if you want to call it that. But the numbers, the concept of the numbers really didn't come into fruition until a little bit later. They had numbers there, but it wasn't as scientifically important. Except in counting sheep and dogs,
yes,
and, different things.
They had a way of accounting for the wealth, if you will. I've got so many coins, or I've got so many sheep, or whatever like that. But as far as looking at the Scripture, they used it more of a symbolic type of way, rather than as 1, 2, rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, and whatever. Like I said, 1,000 doesn't mean the number after 999. It's just a very large number.
And speaking of those symbols, then, the Book of Revelation is full of symbols.
Yes, it is, and that's the reason why you can't read it literally. I'll read a verse to you, and we'll go through that. This is in chapters 5 of Revelation. Then I saw, standing in the midst of the throne, and the 4 living creatures and the elders, a lamb that seemed to have been slain. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes. These are the 7 spirits of God sent into the whole world. All right.
You mean there isn't a lamb with 7 eyes, 7 horns, and 4 eyes?
I haven't seen one yet. But the lamb, the word "the lamb," and it's capitalized in this verse, refers to Jesus Christ, the lamb that was slain.
Oh, okay. All right.
And the slain is that the lamb that seemed to have been slain, he was crucified. But earlier in the verse, it says he saw the lamb standing, which refers back to the resurrection.
I see.
All right.
I see.
So the lamb was slain, he was crucified, he was resurrected. All right. He had 7 horns. 7, as I mentioned earlier, is an indication of completeness. Okay. The horns refer to power.
I can see that.
So this lamb has complete power.
I see.
He's omnipotent.
Oh, okay. All right.
He is God. Okay. And the 7 eyes refer to knowledge, because you can see everything.
I see.
And he's got 7 eyes, so he can completely see everything. So he's omniscient now. He knows everything.
Okay. All right.
So, and like I said, a Hollywood director could have taken this and made quite a movie out of it. But it's not that type of a book. I mean, you can't read it like that. You have to figure out what the symbols mean, and then put yourself into that context to get the meaning of the book.
Is it true that since we did not have a lot of written material back then, that oftentimes individuals, when they talked about certain kinds of history or certain kinds of things, that they used different symbols, and that to us, we're so used to literal things.
Mm-hmm.
If you bring in a lamb with 7 eyes, we would take that as literal.
Right.
But the pictures that individuals had back then had to be mental. And so what you're saying is they use those symbols so that people could actually feel and sense.
Yeah, when the books, especially of the New Testament, were written, then what they did at that point in time, a lot of the writers would take phrases. If they didn't directly quote the Old Testament scripture,
Okay.
they would take phrases and say, I don't know, for example, the lamb in Revelation, a verse might go, the lamb comes amidst the clouds. All right. If you were well versed in the Old Testament scriptures at that time, you would take that phrase, "in the midst of a cloud," back to the prophet Daniel.
Okay.
In the Old Testament.
All right.
And the prophet Daniel referred to God coming later in the midst of a cloud.
Okay.
So that's how a lot of this.
Yeah, so what you're saying is the book of Revelation also is a reference to some of the older Old Testament books. Mm-hmm. I see.
There's a lot of references in the Old Testament. There are about somewhere between 200 and 1,000 references to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, which is actually quite a bit when you consider that the book of Revelation only has about 450 or so verses in it.
Oh, okay.
And the difference comes in what you count as a reference to the Old Testament. Some people count it simply as a word, and some people count it as a phrase.
I see.
So
I see. Huh, that's interesting. Hey, and so when the book of Revelation was written, some individuals who are being persecuted and who are living a very difficult time probably needed some kind of assurance that Christ was on hand to assist them.
Well, all of the New Testament refers to Christ coming back at the end of time.
Okay.
It's what they call an eschatological thing, meaning the end of time. So the book was written, and like the rest of the books of the New Testament, give comfort to people who are being persecuted, particularly in this case Christians. But it should give comfort to everybody. And that a lot of people think that since the book of Revelation was written about the end of somewhere near the end of the first century, that they believe that Jesus coming back soon, that would be the end of time.
I see.
Well, it's now been 2,000 years later, and
a few years since then.
A few years. So that's another thing that you have to figure out what soon means in the life of God.
Sure.
And it's not a few minutes or a few months or a few years. But anyway, the book of Revelation is supposed to be giving comfort to people, and it actually does that, and it does that all throughout our history. The people of the first century were being persecuted, and this book, reading this in later centuries too, into the second century up until Christianity was legalized, they would read this book and they would know that God or Jesus will come back and to help us and lead us forward. And they read this as a comforting book once they understood the language. Well, we can still do that today.
Sure.
If you look at our life today, the media, everything we see and hear is trying to lead us to a secularized society, which says, you don't need anything. You are the controller of your destiny.
I see.
And we don't have the idol. We don't see much of the idol worship that was prevalent during the early Christian times of the Roman gods or the Greek gods or whatever. But we have other things that people seem to worship today. It could be wealth, power.
Sure.
It could be, some celebrity of some sort.
Sure.
An athlete or a movie star.
Yeah.
We've gone from idol worship to a more
secularized,
if you will, type of worship.
Yeah.
Not God, but of things.
Well, that is true. It is often said that if you are comfortable in your life, the need for some kind of spiritual assistance is lessened.
Yes.
And I know that at least in some of the European and Americas, where we are a land of wealth, I can certainly understand why individuals would feel that. But if you go to those countries or those cultures that don't have the wealth that we have, there's more of a spiritual need.
Yes, they understand that to live, just basic living, they don't need money. They need something else to help this.
I understand.
So if it's not a Christian society, for example, they might pray to the god of the rain or whatever to help provide them with rain for their crops.
Sure.
If it's a Christian society or a Jewish society, for example, in an impoverished part of the world, or even perhaps a Muslim society, they would pray to God to provide them for rain.
Yeah, and it is interesting, of the 7 major religions, each religion has their own set of beliefs, and each one feels that they are empowered by the Almighty to be the spokesman for the Almighty, and that's where we get into conflicts.
Conflicts, yes, because we don't always see eye to eye on things.
So you're saying that the Book of Revelation had its origin in a time of crisis,
right?
And that it really helped individuals to have that sense of encouragement.
Right, like I said, the Christians at the time of the writing of the Book of Revelation, the Christian community was being persecuted, and it was persecuted for off and on for a couple of hundred years after that. And then during periods of strife, for example, the Europeans had various wars throughout the centuries. During the 20th century, we had the First World War and the Second World War in Korea, and the Cold War with the threat of atomic weapons. There have always been strife in human history, and people in more, let's call it more Christian times, if you will, would have turned to the Bible and perhaps even to the Book of Revelation itself to get comfort from that, which by reading the Book of Revelation, the way it was written in kind of a cyclic type sense, it would go forward as a kind of a prophetic book into the future, and then come back to the present, and then go back again. And you got different views of different things, kind of like going up a mountain, around and around. You get a different view as you go around the mountain. This brought comfort to the people, knowing that God will come again, Jesus Christ will come again, and that gave them comfort, knowing that it may not be tomorrow or the next day, but he will come and
Sure. Yeah, and I know that again the symbols. It's interesting. We hear the horsemen of the apocalypse.
Right.
There's let's see. I have my own opinions, and that's the problem. You hear bits and pieces, and then you form your own opinions of them. And then when you see on TV or the movies the four horsemen of apocalypse, etc., oh my gosh, next thing you know, you sort of draw the conclusion that if you see four horsemen.
Yeah, well, these are just the four horsemen is kind of indicative of the periods of strife that humanity has gone through over the periods of time. And again, we have to go back to something else rather than just looking at our own situation and saying, "Oh my, woe is me." We go to those places of comfort that we have in the Christian world that happens to be the Bible and the life of Jesus and our eternal salvation.
It's also interesting. This I did not know. In the book of Revelation, they talked about the beast and the number 666. And I always thought that it wasn't necessarily a part of the book of Revelation, but that's where some individuals see that as the beast is Satan. And if you see the number 666,
that's the sign of the beast.
So there's a lot of significance to those kinds of beliefs, and I don't mean to make light of anyone's particular belief in whatever. But symbols are symbols.
It's a symbol, and there's the number 6 refers itself. The number 6 itself refers to incompleteness.
Oh, okay. All right.
Now, I haven't studied the book of Revelation enough. I was going to save that for another episode.
That would be good. Yeah, I'd like to find out more about
the number. I have to go through and kind of compare the symbols to actually come down to what the actual number 6 is.
That is something that I'd like to pursue. Again, we look at the numbers a lot different than when the numbers were written during the times of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament.
Right. Yeah, things are a lot different now than they were then.
Yeah. And I would also be interested in how they arrived at the number 144,000. I found that interesting too. And
we can go into that in another episode.
Yeah, that sounds good. Hey, we're with Deacon Terry Acox. Terry Acox serves as a deacon to 7 churches in the Portsmouth area or Scioto County area. He's been very actively involved in the ministry with the different churches in the area, etc. Terry, it's always a pleasure talking with you. I really enjoy learning. My knowledge of Revelation has grown. I want to say 100% because I did not know that much about it. So, I'm Patrick Dengel, Deacon Terry Acox. We thank you very much for Inspirational Focus on this episode, and we look forward to next month's telecast.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.